Millionaire CEO defends a single dad waiter, unaware he's a millionaire in disguise secret job. Before the story begins, let's make this personal. What brought you here today? A recommendation, curiosity, or maybe just the universe guiding you? The alarm went off at 4:47 a.m., same as every morning. Nathan Caldwell didn't groan. He sat up cleanly, quietly, the way a person does when they've trained themselves to be silent out of necessity. When there's a 6-year-old boy sleeping in the next room who still cried out in his sleep sometimes, calling for someone who wasn't there anymore. He sat on the edge of the bed for 60 seconds. That was his rule. 1 minute of stillness before the world asked anything of him. Outside, Midtown was beginning its gray-orange pre-dawn stir. Distant sirens, the low rumble of delivery trucks, the city assembling itself with that particular restlessness Nathan had once found urgent and now found almost comforting. The way familiar noise becomes ambient. The apartment was small. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a kitchen that opened into a living room barely large enough for a couch, and a round table with 4 chairs, though only 2 were ever used. The walls were plain, white mostly, except for one corner of the living room where Mason had pressed his painted handprints in green and orange and blue when he was 4 years old. And Nathan had never painted over them. He never would. He dressed in the dark without turning on the overhead light. He'd learned the geography of this apartment months ago, knew where every edge was. Started the coffee. Packed Mason's lunch. A peanut butter sandwich cut diagonally because Mason had once declared that triangles tasted better than rectangles and had never revised this position. A bag of apple slices with a small container of caramel dip, a juice box, and, tucked carefully in the corner of the bag, a folded note. Nathan wrote one every single day. Sometimes it was a bad joke that required explanation. Sometimes it was just, "I'm proud of you. See you at 3. He signed them N, not Dad. It had started as a game when Mason was 4 and decided grown-up names were cooler than family titles. Neither of them had thought to stop it. By 5:15, Nathan was dressed for work. Black slacks, white button-down, non-slip shoes, and scrolling through business notes on his phone. A flagged acquisition in the Pacific Northwest that his silent partner had messaged him about. A response he owed to a board he technically still chaired, though his name appeared nowhere on the letterhead. The number in his brokerage account, which had crossed a threshold last week that once would have felt like an arrival. He read all of it the way a surgeon reads a chart before scrubbing in, focused, complete, unemotional, and then turned the screen off and put the phone in his pocket. None of that world had anything to do with today. Today, like every Tuesday through Saturday, Nathan Caldwell would take the number 6 train to 28th Street, walk 4 blocks east, and spend 8 hours as a waiter at Harlow's Diner, a mid-century place with red vinyl stools and black and white checkered floors and a laminated menu that hadn't changed since 2009. He'd been doing it for 14 months. He'd chosen Harlow's because it was the kind of place where nobody important ever came in. The suits stayed in Midtown. The tourists stayed below 23rd. The neighborhood regulars, construction workers, nurses on double shifts, retired men with nowhere to be, looked at a man carrying plates and saw exactly that. A man carrying plates, nothing more. That was what Nathan needed. To be nothing more. Nathan's commute was 22 minutes on a good day. He stood in the subway car with the practiced balance of a longtime New Yorker, feet apart, one hand on the overhead rail, body absorbing the sway and rattle, and thought about Mason. "I'm proud of you" felt inadequate sometimes as a shorthand for everything that was actually true. What he was proud of was not performance or achievement. It was the boy's specific quality of attention, the way Mason moved through the world like someone who had decided very early that noticing things mattered, that the correct shade of brown was worth caring about, that the way light fell across a face was a fact worth remembering. He had been told, twice, by 2 different therapists in the 18 months after Rebecca died, that he was channeling grief into overinvestment in his son's development. He had considered this carefully and concluded it was partially true, and that both therapists were missing something important. Mason was remarkable not because Nathan needed him to be, but because he simply was. He got off at 28th Street into the cool, thin air of a Tuesday in October and walked east with his hands in his pockets. Mason woke up angry, not at anything specific. At 6 years old, anger didn't always need a reason. It was just there sometimes when he opened his eyes, a tightness in his chest, a heat behind his ears. Nathan had learned, in the 25 months since he'd been doing this alone, that the best response was not to address it head-on, not to cheerfully attempt to dissolve it, but to be present and let it have its shape. "I don't want Cheerios," Mason said, staring at the bowl. "Okay." Nathan moved to the cabinet, unhurried. "Oatmeal?" "I don't want oatmeal." "Toast?" Mason looked at the table, then at his hands. "Fine. Toast." Nathan put 2 slices in. Mason climbed onto his chair and pulled his knees to his chest. His armor. The thing he held when the world felt too loud and too much. Nathan sat across from him with his coffee and didn't talk. That was what Mason needed in the mornings. The steady, undemanding presence of someone who wasn't going anywhere. At 6:22, Mason looked up. "Are you going to the restaurant today?" "Yes." "Will you be home for dinner?" "By 6:30. Mason looked back at his toast. "Okay." That was it. That was the whole conversation. It was enough because it was honest, and with Mason, honest was always enough. Vivian Cole had not slept. This was not unusual. She'd stopped sleeping reliably around age 24, approximately when she'd stopped being the person other people expected her to be, and started becoming the person she actually was. Harder, sharper, considerably more alone. She lay in her king-size bed on the 23rd floor of a building on Lexington Avenue and stared at the ceiling and ran through numbers, revenue projections, staff restructuring timelines, the earnings call she had in 11 days, and Theodore Vance, 67, old money, visibly annoyed every time she spoke, who had been quietly lobbying 2 other board members to push for an operational review. Corporate language for, "We don't trust you." She sat up at 5:30, made coffee, black, stood at her floor-to-ceiling windows and looked at the city below. She had earned this view. Every inch of it. At 28, she was the youngest CEO in her company's history, a position she'd fought toward for 6 years at a cost she didn't catalog, because cataloging it required feeling it, and she had learned years ago to keep a certain distance from feeling. She dressed, put on the armor, charcoal blazer, slim black trousers, heels that added 2 inches she didn't need but wore because height was a language in boardrooms, and she had learned every dialect. She stood before her mirror and looked. Really looked, not the quick efficiency check she usually ran. And something moved behind her eyes. Some unformed thing she turned away from before it could become a thought. She would walk today. The pressure had built to the level where walking was necessary, when her chest felt compressed into a smaller space than it should occupy. The city at 6:45 was quieter, more honest. She needed 20 minutes of not being Vivian Cole, CEO, just Vivian, a woman in good shoes moving through morning. She aimed for the coffee cart on 29th Street, but a construction detour, orange cones, a closed sidewalk, sent her left instead of right, down an unfamiliar block, and she ended up in front of a diner with a neon open sign glowing red and a handwritten card taped beneath it. Real coffee, real food, no attitude. She went in. Warm inside. Coffee and bacon and something baking. Biscuits, maybe. The yeasty sweetness of dough in a hot oven. Checkered floor worn smooth in the center from decades of foot traffic. Vinyl stools cracked at the edges but clean. The whole place had the particular comfort of somewhere that had never been designed at all, just accumulated over years into something that simply worked. She sat at the counter. A man appeared. Tall, 6'1" maybe, moving with quiet efficiency that was unusual for the setting. He set down a coffee cup, poured without asking, and placed a menu beside it without any performance of welcome. "Morning," he said. "Take your time." Low voice. Eyes that met hers briefly. Dark and calm. Not the calm of ease, but the calm of deliberate choice. He wore the uniform without self-consciousness, as if the clothes were simply clothes and had no meaning beyond function. She ordered eggs and toast. The diner filled slowly. Construction workers. A nurse still in scrubs. 2 older men in the back corner who greeted each other with the ease of 40 years friendship. Then a different kind of person walked in. Heavy-set 50s, expensive watch, custom-fitted shirt. He dropped onto a stool 2 seats from Vivian with the exaggerated ease of a man who believed rooms rearranged themselves for him. He snapped his fingers. Nathan appeared. "What do you have that's worth eating?" the man said, not opening the menu. "Everything's good. The Eggs Benedict is popular this morning." "Are these eggs from a real farm or a warehouse operation?" "I don't know the specific farm, but I can find out." The man waved him off. "Just coffee. Make sure the cup's clean." He looked up at Nathan with flat dismissal. "People like you always think they're owed something. Carrying plates, big deal." The diner softened the way rooms do when something has shifted in the air. Vivian set down her cup, turned. "Excuse me," she said. The man looked at her, made the automatic recalibration, the slight straightening end of a certain kind of man encountering a certain kind of woman. "He was doing his job," Vivian said, level and quiet, the same voice she used in boardrooms when she was closing a position. "With more patience than most people would manage. You don't need to speak to him that way. This is a private conversation." You were loud enough that it wasn't. He opened his mouth. "And the cup," she added with the precision of someone who knows exactly where the final line lands, "was clean." She turned back to her eggs. A long pause. The man stood, left money on the counter, walked out. The diner exhaled. Then, very low, right beside her, "Thank you for that." She looked up. Nathan stood with the coffee pot, wearing an expression she couldn't immediately name. Not exactly gratitude, not embarrassment. Something more complex. The specific look of a man genuinely surprised to be seen by a stranger. "He was rude," she said. "People are sometimes. That's not a reason to let it go." He held her eyes for a moment, refilled her cup without being asked, moved away. She watched him, efficient, contained, unhurried, and felt a thought form that she didn't try to dissolve. Something about this man does not add up. She left a 20 for a $9 meal and walked out into the gray morning. 4 blocks away. She admitted to herself she would come back tomorrow. She came back the next morning. She told herself it was the coffee, and it was good, genuinely better than the cart on 29th. But the truth sat beneath that explanation like a stone under shallow water, visible if you looked directly, easy to step around if you didn't. Vivian Cole did not make decisions by accident. In every other area of her life, she was pitilessly self-aware about motivation. This morning, she simply chose not to look directly. She walked into Harlow's at 6:52 and sat at the same stool, second from the left. Nathan appeared with the coffee pot before she'd opened the menu. He didn't say "back again," or any of the things a person with different instincts might have said. Just poured, set the pot down and asked, "Same as yesterday or something different?" "Same," she said. He nodded and moved away. The diner was busier than Tuesday. A table of 4 near the window and the painters, by their clothes, working through pancakes with the focused pleasure of men who'd been at work since 5. An older woman at the far end of the counter had a newspaper folded to the crossword and a cup of tea she refreshed methodically. A radio above the kitchen pass-through played something from the 70s. Low enough to feel rather than hear. Vivian opened her laptop. She told herself she'd work, check emails, review the presentation deck her team had revised at 11 last night. She pulled it up and stared at slide 4, the revenue chart with its optimistic upward curve, and found, which almost never happened, that the numbers were not fully holding her attention. She was watching Nathan. He moved through the diner with that same contained efficiency. But now she had more time to observe it, and what she noticed was a double quality to how he operated. On one level, he was doing exactly what a good waiter does, refilling drinks, managing the rhythm of the room, carrying plates with clean balance. But at a different level, he was watching, not suspiciously, but in the way of someone who reads patterns, who processes data, who is perpetually a step ahead of what appears to be happening. When a table of 3 sat near the window, he had their coffee poured before they'd opened their menus, having read something in their manner that told him they were regulars, despite no exchange of recognition. When the older woman with the crossword frowned, pencil hovering, Nathan passed her section and said quietly, 7 letters. Historical Roman port, starts with O, Ostia, and kept walking. The woman's pencil moved. She also noted the way he handled the small crises of the morning. A table that waited too long. A customer who sent food back. A brief gap in service when two orders collided. He navigated all of it with a specific equanimity she recognized as unusual. Not the equanimity of someone who didn't care. The equanimity of someone who had decided that certain things were temporary and manageable, and was saving a different kind of weight for things that were not. That distinction, between what deserved your full self and what didn't, was something she had spent years trying to calibrate. He seemed to have already done that work. Vivian shut the laptop. Nathan appeared with her eggs. "How long have you worked here?" she asked. The question didn't seem to surprise him. 14 months, he said. Before that? A pause. Not hesitation exactly, more like conscious selection. Other things, he said. And it was delivered so evenly it managed to convey both "I could tell you more," and "I've chosen not to" simultaneously. Fair enough, Vivian said. He moved on. She ate her eggs and thought about the way he'd said other things, and knew she had no rational basis for the feeling that was forming, which was that other things was a significant understatement. That afternoon, Nathan picked Mason up from school at 3:15. Mason came out of the building slightly behind the other kids, not isolated exactly, but not embedded either. He had two boys he sometimes played with, a tentative best friendship still in its early formation, but he had always been fundamentally self-contained. Moving through first grade with the same reserved observation Nathan recognized as his own, probably transmitted without meaning to. "How was art?" Nathan asked. "I drew my self-portrait." "How'd it turn out?" Mason considered this with the seriousness he applied to most things. "I made my hair too brown. It's darker. You could fix it next class. Mrs. Pacheco said we move on next week." He kicked a pebble off the sidewalk with precise intent. "I'll just remember for next time." Nathan looked at his son, the set of his jaw, the way he was already measuring his own work against an interior standard most adults didn't hold themselves to, and felt the particular, complicated love of a parent who sees their child clearly and is moved by exactly what they see. They stopped at the library on the way home. Mason had a system, always 3 books, chosen by a weighting method he'd developed and occasionally revised. One for a topic he already loved, one for a topic he was actively investigating, and one chosen by spine design alone, his built-in allowance for chance. Today, a book about deep-sea fish, a book about ancient Egypt, and a slim picture book about a boy who built a boat from things he found in a field. Nathan crouched beside him at the shelf. Mason had the deep-sea fish book open to a page he'd found before completing his other selections, and was reading, standing up with the focused stillness of a child who had temporarily forgotten he was in a public place. Nathan waited. After a long moment, Mason looked up and said, "It makes light to attract prey, but the prey think it's something beautiful, so they swim toward it." He paused. "That's kind of sad." "Which part?" Nathan asked. Mason thought about it with genuine care. "That beautiful things can be dangerous," he said, and went back to reading. Nathan stood slowly, feeling that particular mixture of wonder and helplessness that Mason produced in him sometimes, the sense of someone growing faster than any framework could contain. They checked out their books and walked home through the amber October afternoon, Mason carrying the bag with both hands because he preferred to carry it himself. Nathan made pasta for dinner, canned tomatoes, garlic, herbs from the small basil pot on the windowsill. And while Mason ate, reading the deep-sea fish book propped against the fruit bowl, Nathan looked at the message from his silent partner, Lucas Yen. Lucas was 53, a former hedge fund manager and the first outside investor in what had eventually become the third largest private equity firm Nathan had quietly co-founded 6 years ago. The message was, as Lucas's messages always were, carefully indirect. The Pacific Northwest situation is moving faster than anticipated. The other parties are circling. Your signature isn't required yet, but your perspective would prevent several decisions I'd rather not make alone. Whenever you're ready. Nathan read it twice, closed it, looked at Mason, who had turned a page and was studying a photograph of an anglerfish with the expression of someone who had found something genuinely profound. "Hey," Nathan said. Mason looked up. "You good?" Mason considered this. The anglerfish makes its own light, he said. It doesn't need the sun, it just has it inside. Built in? He looked at the page. I think that's really cool. It is cool, Nathan agreed. Mason went back to his book. Nathan closed Lucas's message again. Not tonight. Tonight the anglerfish had the light built in and the pasta was good, and the basil smelled like summer. The world could wait. Thursday. Vivian came back. This was now a pattern, and she had stopped pretending she didn't know it. What she'd assembled over 3 mornings, the way she assembled information on companies she was evaluating, was a set of data points that didn't cohere into an obvious picture, but felt significant anyway. First, he was exceptionally smart, not obviously so, which was partly what made it striking. It came through in small moments, in the precision with which he spoke, in the quality of attention he paid to everything around him. The kind of intelligence that came not from training, which can be performed, but from actual cognitive speed. Second, he was not afraid of money, and he was not hungry for it either. She'd spent enough time around people from various economic backgrounds to know the signatures. People who grew up without money had specific relationships to wealth, resentment or hunger or hyper-awareness of its signals. People who grew up with it had their own. Nathan had neither. He moved through the diner with the ease of someone who had long ago stopped caring about relative hierarchies. Someone for whom the question had been settled and set aside. Third, the quality of his silence. Not the silence of someone with nothing to say. The silence of someone who had made a deliberate choice about what kind of life they were living and was at peace with it. A purposeful silence, the kind that requires tremendous interior resources to maintain. She was on her second cup when her phone buzzed. Her assistant, the board meeting had been moved to Friday morning. Theodore Vance's request. She set the phone face down on the counter. Bad news? Nathan said, passing by. What makes you think it's bad news? You turned the phone over. She stared at him. I do that too, he said simply, and moved on. She picked the phone back up and started composing a response to her assistant. But she was thinking about what he'd said, I do that too, and the small, plain intimacy of it, the way it had assumed shared experience without preamble or performance. At 8 o'clock, she packed up to leave. She was pulling on her jacket when the door opened and a woman in a gray coat came in, holding the hand of a small boy. The boy was compact and precise-looking with dark, focused eyes and hair that was almost but not quite the right shade of brown. He wore a backpack with a small pin on the strap, an orange fish, an anglerfish, she realized. He stopped when he saw Nathan, looked at him with the flat, assessing seriousness of a 6-year-old who takes things seriously. Mrs. Torres called in sick. Mrs. Kim had to pick me up. I see that. Nathan crouched to his eye level, effortlessly. You have everything? My library book's still in my cubby. We'll get it Monday. The anglerfish one? I'll call the school. The boy seemed to decide this was satisfactory. He looked then at Vivian, a careful, contained assessment that was startling on a face that small. His eyes moved over her blazer, her laptop bag, her heels. Something in his expression closed slightly, like a door not quite pulled all the way shut. He looked back at his father and said nothing. Nathan stood. To Vivian simply, This is Mason. Hi, Mason, Vivian said. Mason did not say hello. He looked at Nathan and said, Can I sit at the counter? The usual spot. The boy moved to the far end of the counter, set his backpack on the stool beside him like a wall, opened his book with the deliberate absorption of someone who had ended a conversation and did not intend to reopen it. Vivian looked at Nathan. Something in his expression was careful and calm. He's not, Nathan started. He doesn't have to be anything, Vivian said. He's 6. Nathan looked at her for a moment. Then, very quietly, Yeah. She left. 3 blocks away, she identified what she had heard in that one small word. It was relief. Friday came in gray, October cloud cover low and settled over the city, and Vivian was awake at 4:30 with the board meeting sitting across her chest like a second body. Theodore Vance had been on the board for 9 years, through 2 previous CEOs. Old guard in the specific way of men who had operated in institutional structures so long, they confused familiarity with authority. Not unintelligent. She had never dismissed him on those grounds. But the kind of man who found female confidence somehow illegitimate, who heard decisive speech and filed it under aggressive rather than effective, and who had been making quiet, low-level maneuvers since her very first week in the role. She dressed, drank coffee at the window, ran through the board meeting in her head, every argument, every number, every potential challenge and her prepared response, and felt the armoring process complete itself, the way it always did in the hour before she walked into something that required full force. But she still walked to Harlow's first. She was there by 6:40 earlier than usual. The diner was in its quiet morning state, tables mostly empty, grill not yet at full speed. Nathan appeared almost immediately. "Early today," he said, pouring her coffee. "Board meeting." He set the pot down and looked at her. "The one you turned your phone over for?" She was startled he'd remembered. "Yes." A pause. Then, "Do you want to talk through it?" The offer was made so simply, no performance of helpful concern, no professional coaching frame, just a direct "do you want this?" that it caught her off guard in a way very few things did. "You don't know anything about my business," she said. "No. But I know how to listen without having a stake in the outcome. Sometimes that's more useful." She studied him. "Why would you?" "You defended me Tuesday morning," he said evenly. "A stranger. You didn't have to. This is considerably less than that." Vivian looked at her coffee. For the next 45 minutes she talked. Not everything. She was not a person who disclosed carelessly, and she was aware that she knew almost nothing about this man. But the structural problem, the board dynamics, the Vance situation, she laid it out with the precision she used in presentations. Clean and unsentimental, and Nathan listened without interrupting, without the small sounds and affirmations that indicate a person is only managing the appearance of listening. He simply listened. When she finished, a pause. "You have one member who's wavering," Nathan said. "The two others Vance is working. You said one of them built her reputation on clean governance. She won't move unless she's convinced there's a legitimate oversight failure. There isn't one. So what Vance needs is for the meeting itself to create the appearance of a failure in real time. He'll push you to react. Say something that reads as defensive rather than confident." Vivian stared at him. "Don't take the bait," he said. "State your position once clearly and don't restate it. Reiteration reads as insecurity. Confidence in a boardroom is exactly the same as confidence anywhere else. It's the willingness to let silence do work." She was quiet for a long moment. "Where did you learn to read a room like that?" she asked. The familiar pause, not evasion but selection. "I spent some years doing work that required it," he said. "What kind of work?" He picked up the coffee pot. "The kind that required listening carefully," he said, quietly precise. He refilled her cup and moved on. She sat with that answer. The kind that required listening carefully. It was either the most beautifully vague statement she'd ever heard or the most informative one. She genuinely could not tell which. She crushed the board meeting. It went exactly as Nathan had said it would. Vance pushed in the third agenda item, a governance question about the Pacific Northwest portfolio, framed as legitimate oversight. She answered once clearly, without qualification or defense, and sat back. The silence did its work. The wavering board member, Dr. Sandra Okafor, asked two specific clarifying questions. Vivian answered both directly. Sandra's expression moved from uncertain to satisfied, and the meeting moved forward. Vance said nothing further. Afterward, alone in the elevator, Vivian stood and thought about the fact that a waiter in a mid-century diner had read the situation more accurately than the 3 advisors she'd paid for preparation. She also thought about Theodore Vance's face when she didn't restate her position. The tight jaw. The recalculation happening behind his eyes when the room didn't move the way he'd engineered it to. She had not felt triumphant. She had felt tired in a specific way she recognized. The tiredness of having been right in an environment that made being right feel like a cost rather than a reward. That was the thing Nathan had somehow understood from the outside. Not just the mechanics of the boardroom, but the weight of operating in spaces that were not designed with you in mind. She didn't know how he understood it, but he had. She pressed the lobby button and stood with that thought without pushing it away. That evening she did something she'd never done before. She looked up Nathan R. Caldwell. His name had come through a staffing agency, which was interesting in itself since most long-term diner staff were direct hires, and there was no employment history on the public-facing portion she could access. She was not, she reminded herself, someone who ran background checks on people she'd had breakfast with. She closed the search. She sat at her window and thought, Nathan R. Caldwell, who has no history I can find, who moves like a man who is deliberately choosing to be exactly where he is, who listens like someone accustomed to making consequential decisions, who has a 6-year-old son with an anglerfish pin on his backpack, who had said without melodrama, I do that too, about turning away from bad news, as if shared human experience were the simplest, most ordinary thing to offer. She was drawn to him. She let herself know that clearly, not act on it. Not yet. She had years of discipline around the gap between what she felt and what she decided, but know it without distortion. Both things were true. Saturday morning. Nathan was at the diner at 6. By 8 it was in its weekend rhythm, tables turning slower, people lingering over newspapers and second cups. Mason was at a birthday party until noon. Nathan had the morning to himself, which happened rarely enough that he felt it as a quality of the air, a slight lightness. He noticed when Vivian came in. He always noticed now, and that itself was something he'd been sitting with, not alarmed by, but attentive to. The way you notice a shift in barometric pressure before a change in weather. She sat at the counter. He poured her coffee. Their exchange had the easy quality of two people who had found an unspoken rhythm that didn't require naming. She was reading something on her phone with the calm of someone who had settled something. The meeting went well? He asked. She looked up, smiled. A real one, not the controlled professional version. Something more open than he'd seen from her before. It was perfect, she said. Good. You were right, about the silence. Something warm moved in his chest, careful and quiet. You did the work, he said. I just said words. Very accurate words. He moved on, came back. They were quiet together for a while, which was its own kind of conversation. At 9:30, his phone buzzed. A notification from Mason's school app, a message from Mrs. Pacheco, flagged please review when you have a moment. He clicked through. Mr. Caldwell, I wanted to reach out directly because what Mason did this week was remarkable enough that I didn't want it lost in the weekly update. During our self-portraits project, the other children worked from mirrors. Mason put the mirror down after about 2 minutes and worked entirely from memory. The portrait was technically extraordinary. The proportions, the specific way light fell across his face, the precise shade of his hair. But what was most striking was what he told me when I asked how he did it. He said, I already know what I look like. I just needed to decide which version to show. I've taught first grade for 11 years and I have never had a student say something like that. He is remarkable, Mr. Caldwell. Truly. Nathan stood still in the narrow space between the counter and the kitchen pass-through, reading it again. I already know what I look like. I just needed to decide which version to show. He thought of Mason at breakfast, furiously precise about the color of his hair. Mason with the anglerfish saying the light was built in. Mason at the far end of the counter on Thursday, setting his backpack down like a wall, building the border he needed calmly at 6 years old, with more interior competence than most adults Nathan had ever met. He felt it then, the full, complicated weight of loving someone that much. The fear living inside it, the specific ache of watching someone so young be so capable and knowing there were things you could not carry for them no matter how much you wanted to. He put his phone away and came back to the counter. Vivian looked at him. Everything okay? He thought about saying yes, fine, his default for 14 months, but instead, my son's teacher sent a message. He did something in school. He stopped, searching for the words. He's 6 years old, and he already has more self-knowledge than most people I've ever met. Vivian was quiet for a moment. Then, that sounds like something that makes you proud and scared at the same time. He looked at her. Yeah, he said. Exactly that. The pause between them had a different quality than the ones before it, something more present in it, more specific to the two of them. Then Nathan's manager waved from the kitchen, a table of 8 near the window. and Nathan straightened, picked up the coffee pot and moved away. But he could feel, with the precision of someone who had learned to pay close attention to things he couldn't afford to ignore, that something had shifted. Not dramatically, not with announcement, just quietly, the way things shift when they are beginning. He thought of Mason on Thursday, the careful closed assessment of his dark eyes moving over Vivian, the backpack set against the stool like a wall, the way Mason had directed every word to Nathan and none to her, with the deliberate economy of a child who had made a decision and was going to hold to it. His son would need to warm to her if this became anything real, and Mason did not warm easily. Mason took his time, built his trust in small, private increments, and gave it, when he gave it at all, with a totality that made every single step toward it matter enormously. Nathan did not know yet what this was, what he and Vivian were or were becoming, but he knew for the first time in 14 months that the question was real and worth carrying. Across the counter, Vivian had gone back to her phone, but she was not reading it. She was watching the city through the window with an expression he couldn't quite see from this angle. And somewhere between them, in the warm, worn air of a diner that smelled like coffee and biscuits and decades of ordinary lives, something that had no name yet was carefully, quietly taking shape, and neither of them was ready to name it, but neither of them, for the first time in a long time, was entirely looking away. Outside, the October sky was still gray and low, but somewhere behind the clouds the light was there, built in, waiting. 3 weeks passed. Vivian came to Harlow's every morning she was in the city, which was most mornings, because she'd stopped finding reasons not to. She told herself it was routine, and routine was something she valued. She told herself the coffee was genuinely exceptional. She told herself a lot of things, and the things she told herself got slightly less convincing every day, and she had decided, with the pragmatic self-honesty that governed most of her life, to simply let that be true without forcing it into a category. Nathan always poured her coffee before she opened the menu. She always ordered the same thing. They talked in the mornings, really talked, not the surface-level pleasantries of two people filling silence, but the kind of conversation that has weight and direction and builds on itself, the way real conversations do. She told him about the Vance situation, which was ongoing and evolving. He listened and offered exactly the right amount of input, enough to be useful, never so much that it crowded her own thinking. She asked him questions about Mason, and he answered them with the careful openness of someone who was beginning, slowly, to trust. But something was changing. She could feel it in the quality of the mornings, a growing tension beneath the ease, the specific tension that builds between two people when the unspoken thing between them starts to take up too much room. She arrived on a Wednesday in early November to find the diner fuller than usual, a table of construction workers, 2 nurses, a woman with a stroller, and Nathan moving through the rush with his characteristic focused calm. She sat at the counter and watched him work, and she found herself thinking about what it would cost her to want this. Not the coffee, not the conversation. This. The specific warmth of being in a room where someone knew how she took her coffee and remembered which phone calls she turned away from and understood, without her explaining, what it felt like to operate in spaces that weren't built for you. She had not been held by another person in 14 months. She knew this the way she knew financial data, precisely, without sentiment. She had not allowed it. Nathan came to her end of the counter, poured her coffee, started to move on. "Are you free Saturday evening?" she asked. He stopped, turned, looked at her with that same quality of considered stillness. "Mason is at his grandmother's this weekend," he said. It was not an answer. It was information offered carefully, like a door held partway open. "There's a gallery opening," she said. "A friend of mine, sculpture. I've been putting it off because I hate going to these things alone and my usual." She stopped herself before she could dress it up any further. "I'd like to go with you," she said, simply. Nathan looked at her for a long moment. "Okay," he said. "Just that. No performance, oh. No careful qualification. Okay." And it landed the same way all of his words landed, with the exact weight it was meant to carry. Nothing more. She nodded once and looked back at her coffee. When she left 20 minutes later and stepped out into the cold November morning, she stood on the sidewalk for a moment and felt something she had not felt in a very long time. Anticipation that had nothing to do with the number on a spreadsheet. Nathan spent the rest of that day in a state of quiet self-examination. Not anxiety. He had trained himself out of anxiety years ago, in rooms far less forgiving than his own head, but a clear-eyed assessment of what he was doing, and what it would require. He called his mother-in-law that evening. Eleanor Caldwell, Rebecca's mother, 71, Houston-based, sharp and warm in equal measure, who had been one of the few people in Nathan's life who understood all of him and had never once asked him to explain the choices he'd made after Rebecca died. "I'm thinking about telling someone," he said. A pause. Eleanor knew exactly what he meant by someone and exactly what he meant by telling. "Who?" she asked. "A woman I've been spending time with." Another pause, this one different in quality. "How much time?" 3 weeks of mornings. 3 weeks of mornings is more than people spend with each other in months, Eleanor said. Which was the kind of thing she said. Precise and direct and true. "I know. What's her name?" "Vivian." "Does she know yet? About any of it?" "No." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Then, "Nathan, how long are you planning to carry the whole thing alone?" He didn't answer immediately. He was looking at Mason's handprints on the wall, the green and orange and blue, the specific size of a 4-year-old's palms. "I needed it to be real first," he said finally, before any of it mattered. Eleanor was quiet for a long moment. Then, "It sounds like it might be real," she said. He didn't argue with that. Saturday evening. Nathan met Vivian outside the gallery on 26th Street at 7. He was wearing a charcoal suit, no tie, open collar. And when she saw him, she did something he had not seen her do before. She stopped. For just a fraction of a second, she stopped. And something moved across her face that she didn't immediately control. He felt it too. He didn't look away from it. "You clean up well," she said, recovering herself. "So do you," he said, and he meant it simply, the way he meant most things. She was wearing a deep burgundy dress, structured at the shoulder, and her hair was down in a way it never was in the mornings. She looked like herself, but a version of herself that she'd chosen specifically for tonight. With intent and care, and he was moved by that without being able to fully explain why. The gallery was full of the specific kind of people who came to gallery openings in Chelsea, a mix of genuine art interest and social performance, and Vivian moved through it with the ease of someone who had learned to navigate rooms like this the way Nathan had learned to navigate the diner, adapting to the environment without being changed by it. They stood in front of a large bronze piece, a woman mid-motion, one arm raised, her weight shifting in a way that somehow captured both effort and grace at once, and were quiet for a moment. "Rebecca likes sculpture," Nathan said. Vivian looked at him. This was the first time he had said her name. "She said it was the most honest art form," he continued, "because you can't fake the weight of something. A painting can lie about what something looks like, but a sculpture has to actually stand up." He paused. She was an architect. She thought about weight a lot. Vivian was very still beside him. Not with the careful stillness of someone waiting for him to finish, but with the genuine attention of someone who understood that what was being offered here was significant. "How long ago?" she asked. 2 years and 3 months. He looked at the bronze woman, the raised arm, the perfect balance of effort and grace. "Mason was 3. He doesn't remember her the way I need him to. That's the part I can't." He stopped. "I keep trying to find ways to give him the version of her I knew, the real one. But you can't give someone a person they never had the chance to know." Vivian did not say "I'm sorry." She said, "What was she like?" And Nathan, who had not talked about Rebecca to anyone outside of Eleanor and his therapist in 18 months, talked about Rebecca, the way she laughed at herself, the way she could walk into a building and immediately identify which walls were original and which were added later, reading a structure the way other people read faces, the way she had looked at Mason, newborn, with an expression that Nathan had understood in that moment, was what people meant by the word awe. Vivian listened. She asked questions that were the right questions, Not intrusive, not deflecting, just genuinely interested. And at the end she said, "She sounds like she was extraordinary." "She was," Nathan said, "and she would have liked you." Vivian looked at him. "She had very little patience for people who pretended to be less than they were," he said. "You don't do that." Vivian was quiet for a moment. Then, "Neither do you, though you are, I think, pretending to be somewhat less than you are." He met her eyes. The gallery noise continued around them, but it felt distant. "I know," he said. "I'm going to stop pretending. I just needed to pick the right moment." "And when is that?" she asked. "Soon," he said. "I promise." She looked at him, really looked, with the full force of that intelligence she usually kept aimed at financial structures and boardroom dynamics, and seemed to come to a conclusion. She nodded once, the way she did when she'd decided to trust a position. They had dinner afterward at a small Italian place 2 blocks from the gallery. They talked for 3 hours. When he walked her to her building, she turned at the door and looked at him in the cold November night. "Whatever it is you're not telling me," she said quietly, "I want you to know that I'm not going anywhere." He looked at her, felt the full weight of what she was offering. Not impulsively, not with the intoxication of a first evening's chemistry, but with the deliberate, clear-eyed commitment of someone who made decisions carefully and meant them when she made them. "I know," he said. "Thank you." He walked home in the cold night air and thought about the Pacific Northwest and Lucas and the board and the name that appeared nowhere on any letterhead. And he thought, "It's time." But when he got home and found Mason's drawing spread across the kitchen table, the self-portrait, slightly too brown but achingly precise, pinned to a sheet of blank paper with a note in careful first-grade printing, "Dad, I saved you the good chair." He stood there for a long moment and felt the specific weight of everything he was carrying. Vivian was ready. He was ready. The only one who wasn't ready was Mason. And Mason was the only one whose readiness actually mattered. The revelation did not come the way Nathan had planned. He had intended to tell Vivian on a Sunday morning, quietly, over coffee at the diner on a day when the tables were mostly empty, and the light came in at the angle he associated with calm. He had a version of it prepared in his head. Clear, honest, beginning with Rebecca and ending with the present, the whole arc of the past 2 years laid out with the same precision he would use to present a quarterly report, because that was how he had learned to talk about hard things, by treating them as fact, which they were, and not as confession, which they didn't need to be. He never got to that Sunday morning. It was a Tuesday, 3 weeks after the gallery evening, when Lucas Yen walked into Harlow's diner at 8:15 in the morning. Nathan saw him from across the room and felt the specific stillness of a man who has just watched 2 parts of his life make contact for the first time. Lucas was in his characteristic understated suit, dark navy, no tie, the kind of clothes that communicated wealth through what they didn't try to prove, and he stood at the door for a moment, looking at the checkered floor and the vinyl stools, with an expression of careful neutrality that Nathan recognized as the expression Lucas wore when he was trying very hard not to react to something. Vivian was at the counter. Nathan reached Lucas in 4 steps. "Not here," he said very quietly. Lucas looked at him, looked at Vivian, looked back at Nathan with eyes that were assembled several pieces of information simultaneously. "I wouldn't be here if it weren't urgent," he said. 5 minutes, Nathan said. "Outside." He stepped to the counter, set down his coffee pot. To Vivian, with a calmness he was choosing rather than feeling, "I need to step out for a few minutes. Harold can refill your coffee." Vivian looked at Lucas, looked at Nathan. She was too perceptive not to register that something had just shifted, but she was also too self-possessed to push at it in public. "Of course," she said. Nathan walked outside with Lucas into the cold November air. "The Morrison Group moved up their timeline," Lucas said. "They're presenting to the full committee on Thursday. Without your formal position on record, we're looking at a hostile restructuring that dismantles everything we've built in that corridor." Nathan looked at the street, a delivery truck, 2 commuters, the city in its ordinary Tuesday motion. "Who else knows you're here?" he said. "No one. I came alone." Nathan. Lucas paused. "That woman inside. Who is she?" "Someone I'm seeing." A pause. "Does she know?" Not yet. Lucas looked at him with the specific expression he wore when he wanted to say something but was deciding whether to say it. Then he said it. The Vivian Cole who runs Meridian Capital has been in the news this week. Vance situation. There are photos from a gallery opening. He stopped. She looks like the woman at the counter. Nathan was quiet. You've been dating Vivian Cole, Lucas said, not as a question. I didn't know who she was when we met, Nathan said. She doesn't know who you are. No. Lucas absorbed this. He was a man who had spent 30 years in rooms where information was currency, and he understood the particular geometry of this situation with immediate precision. Nathan, he said, this needs to happen today. I know. Not because of the Morrison Group, because I know, Nathan said again, and his voice carried what it needed to carry. He went back inside. Vivian was at the counter with her coffee. Laptop closed, looking at nothing in particular. She looked up when he came in. She had the expression of someone who has assembled a significant portion of a picture and is waiting quietly to see the rest. Can I come by tonight? He asked. She looked at him. Yes, she said. He held her gaze for a moment. I'm going to tell you everything, he said. I should have told you sooner. I'm sorry I didn't. She was quiet for a moment. Then, very simply, okay. He told Mason that evening before he left for Vivian's building. Mason was at the kitchen table with the Egypt book, working his way through a chapter on the construction of the pyramids with the focused absorption he brought to everything. Nathan sat across from him and waited until Mason looked up. I'm going to tell Vivian something important tonight, Nathan said. Mason's expression did not change, but something in it became more watchful. What kind of important? About who I am. The whole truth. Mason considered this. He had lived alongside Nathan's dual life without ever being asked to participate in the concealment. Nathan had always been careful about that. But he was perceptive enough to know the general shape of it. That his father had money, that the diner was a choice, that there were parts of the world they didn't live in even though they could. Does she know about Mom? Mason asked. Yes, I told her at the gallery. Mason looked at his book, looked at his hands. Does she know about me? Yes. What does she know? That you're the most important person in my life, Nathan said. That you're extraordinary. That you're the reason I do everything I do. Mason was quiet for a long time. Nathan waited. She came in with that man today, Mason said finally. To the diner, the one in the suit. Nathan hadn't known Mason was there, but on Tuesdays, when school let out early, sometimes Eleanor dropped him off for the last hour of the shift. He should have anticipated it. You were there? I was in the back with Harold, Mason said. I saw you go outside. He looked up. She waited for you. She didn't ask Harold anything. She just waited. Nathan absorbed this. She could have asked, Mason said. She didn't. He looked back at his book. That's something. Nathan looked at his son, 6 years old, anglerfish pin on his backpack strap, building his case in the only way he knew how. Evidence gathered quietly, weight assessed carefully, conclusions reached with a deliberateness most adults never managed. Yeah, Nathan said, that's something. He sat across from Vivian in her apartment on the 23rd floor with the city spread out behind her and told her everything. He started with the beginning, built his first company at 22, sold it at 25 for more money than he'd known how to hold. Used that to co-found what became Caldwell Yen Capital with Lucas at 27, the Pacific Northwest portfolio, the board that still carried his decisions in its DNA even though his name appeared on none of its documents. The number, the real number, the one that lived in accounts under structures that had never needed to announce themselves. He told her about Rebecca, the full version, not the gallery opening version, how they'd met at an architectural conference where he'd been a guest speaker at 28, and she'd been in the third row taking notes with a purple pen, and had raised her hand after his talk and asked the most incisive question anyone had asked him in 2 years of giving that talk. How they'd been married in 18 months, how Mason had arrived and how Rebecca had looked at him with that expression of awe, and how she had died, quickly, a brain aneurysm, a Tuesday morning in March, no warning, no goodbye, just gone. When Mason was 3 years old and Nathan was 32 and the world became, overnight, a different shape. He told her about Harlow's. The decision to step back from everything, not because he couldn't function. He was functioning. He was running the whole operation remotely. Lucas held the public face. But because he needed to know what it felt like to be in a room where nobody knew what he was worth, where the only thing that mattered was whether the coffee was hot and the plates were clean. He needed Mason to have a father who came home at 6:30 and packed lunches and wrote notes signed N and knew the soft spot in the hallway floor. He needed to be, for a while, a man carrying plates. Vivian listened to all of it. When he finished, the room was quiet. She looked at him. He held her gaze and did not look away. "You were waiting to see if what we had was real before you told me," she said. Not accusatory, precisely analytical, the way she was analytical about things she was working to understand. "Yes, because you needed to know I wanted you, not the other version." "Yes." She was quiet for another moment. Then she said, "Do you know what the hardest thing about running a company at 28 was? Not the work, not Vance, not the board. It was that I could never tell with anyone I met in that world, whether they were responding to me or to what I represented, whether they saw Vivian or whether they saw Meridian Capital." She paused. "So I understand why you needed to know. I'm not angry about it." He exhaled, a slow, controlled release. "There's more. The Morrison Group." He looked at her. "Lucas Yen," she said simply. "I recognized him this morning. I've been in 2 rooms with him in the past 4 years. I didn't say anything because I figured you'd tell me tonight." She tilted her head. "Caldwell Yen Capital. Nathan R. Caldwell." The air between them shifted. "How long have you known?" he asked. "Since this morning," she said. "Fully, pieces before that." He looked at her. "And you waited. You said you'd tell me everything," she said. "I believed you." He looked at this woman, 28 years old, battle-tested, brilliant, and choosing with full information and eyes wide open to be sitting in this room with him, and felt something he hadn't felt in 2 years and 3 months. Something that had no name in finance, no metric, no spreadsheet column. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. She turned her hand over and held on. "There's one more thing," he said quietly. "The hardest part isn't any of this. The hardest part is Mason." She met his eyes and nodded slowly. "I know," she said. "I've known that since the first morning he set his backpack on the stool next to him." "He's testing everything," Nathan said. "Every day. He's watching you the way he watches everything, quietly, completely, building his case one piece of evidence at a time." "I know," she said again. "He's not going to make it easy." "I'm not asking for easy," Vivian said. "I'm asking for real." Nathan looked at her for a long moment. Outside, 30 feet below, the city moved in its unceasing way, cabs and sirens and the ordinary roar of 10 million lives. Up here, in this room with its floor-to-ceiling windows and its view of everything and its quiet, something had been settled. Not easily, not simply, but truly. "Okay," Nathan said. And it was the same word she had said to him that morning. Carried the same weight, the same deliberate simplicity, the same meaning beneath the meaning. "I'm here. I'm not going anywhere. Let's see what this becomes." December arrived cold and bright. It had been 3 weeks since the night in Vivian's apartment, and the world that Nathan had been living in parallel, the world of Caldwell Yen and Pacific Northwest portfolios and boards that carried his decisions without his name, had reasserted itself in the way that worlds do when you stop pretending they'll wait forever. He was back at work, in the real sense. Calls with Lucas in the mornings before his shift. Decisions he'd been deferring for months. The Morrison Group situation resolved in a way that required 4 days of his full attention and reminded everyone who'd been wondering exactly why his name had been absent from the public record. He kept the diner shifts. 3 mornings a week now instead of 5. Harold understanding without being asked, the way Harold understood most things about Nathan because Harold was 70 years old and had been watching people navigate their lives from behind a counter for 3 decades and had long since stopped being surprised by complexity. Vivian knew the full picture now. She moved between both worlds with a naturalness that should have surprised him but didn't. Because of course she did. She was Vivian Cole, and navigating between the person and the role was something she had been doing her whole adult life. She came to the diner on the mornings he worked. She came to the office on the days when the two of them were operating in the same world, sitting across from Lucas in the glass-walled conference room where nothing about Nathan was hidden, and holding her own with a fluency that made Lucas shoot Nathan a look over her shoulder that meant, "Where did you find her?" The one variable that remained unresolved, unnavigated, refusing to yield to any strategy or patience or careful approach, was Mason. Mason was watching. That was what he did. He watched Vivian the way he watched the anglerfish, with a combination of genuine fascination and deliberate distance, keeping the buffer of that backpack on a stool between them. He was polite when required. He answered direct questions with the minimal accuracy of someone who had not yet decided to give more than was asked. He did not make scenes. He did not cry or rage or act out in any of the ways that would have been easier to address. Because Mason did not do things the easy way when a more considered approach was available. He simply watched and waited and kept his wall exactly where he'd built it. Vivian did not push. This was the thing that Nathan observed with a quiet building wonder. She did not push. She did not try to accelerate Mason's timeline, did not perform warmth or engineer connection, or try to win him with gifts or games or special treatment. She treated him the way she treated everyone whose respect she was not entitled to. She showed up, she was consistent, she was genuinely herself, and she waited. She brought him one thing, once, a book about bioluminescence, creatures of the deep sea that made their own light, which she had found at the bookstore on her block and which she left on the counter at Harlow's one morning without comment, without even addressing it directly to Mason. She just set it there and went back to her coffee. Mason had looked at it from across the diner for 4 full minutes before he got up, walked over, picked it up, and carried it to the far end of the counter without saying anything to anyone. Nathan, from his position near the kitchen pass-through, had watched all of this and felt something press against the inside of his chest. The book went home in Mason's backpack. Nathan never mentioned it. Neither did Mason. The moment came on a Saturday afternoon, 12 days before Christmas. Nathan had taken Mason to the Natural History Museum, a monthly ritual since Mason was 4, when he'd first stood in front of the blue whale suspended from the ceiling of the Ocean Life Hall and gone completely still for 90 seconds and then said, with the seriousness of someone issuing a verdict, "That's real." They went every month. They had a system. Mason chose the hall. Nathan bought the tickets and the hot chocolate from the cart outside, and they moved through it at Mason's pace, which was the pace of someone for whom looking was not passive. Vivian had met them there. This was new. The first time she had been in Nathan and Mason's space together, outside the diner, on their ground rather than hers. She had arrived exactly on time, in jeans and a simple coat, no performance, and had said to Mason, "I hear you're the expert. What are we seeing first?" Mason had looked at her. "Ocean life," he said, and walked ahead. They moved through the hall at Mason's pace. Nathan stayed close but back, watching. Vivian walked beside Mason, not in front, not behind, and looked at the things he looked at without narrating them, without adding the adult overlay of commentary that children usually received whether they wanted it or not. When Mason stopped at a display about deep-sea bioluminescence and stood reading the panel for 3 full minutes, Vivian stood beside him and read it too. At the end of the panel, Mason said, not looking at her, "The anglerfish uses its light to catch things that don't know better." "Yes," Vivian said. "But some bioluminescent creatures use the light to find each other," Mason said. "Not to trap, just to find." "That's right," Vivian said. She paused. "Which kind do you think the light is mostly?" Mason considered this with complete seriousness. "Both," he said, "depending on who's making it." He moved on to the next display. Vivian followed. Nathan stood very still in the hall with the blue whale overhead and the ocean life all around him, and felt something loosen in his chest that he had not known was held tight. It happened on the way home. They were on the subway. Mason between them, which he'd positioned himself deliberately. The geography of a child who was thinking things through, and the train was warm and loud in the way of subway cars in winter, and Mason had his bioluminescence book open on his knees. He closed it without warning, and looked at Vivian. "Do you know what the word abyss means?" he asked. Vivian considered the question with appropriate seriousness. "It means a very deep place," she said. "So deep you can't see the bottom." Mason looked at his book. "My mom's name was Rebecca," he said. "I don't remember her good enough. My dad says she was like the light, but the real kind. Not the trap kind." He paused. "I've been trying to figure out if you're the trap kind." The subway car rattled around them. Nathan did not breathe. "That makes sense," Vivian said very quietly. "It's a smart thing to figure out." "I haven't figured it out yet," Mason said. "That's okay," she said. "There's no deadline." Mason looked at her, the full, direct inventory-taking look that he had been giving her since the first morning at the diner. But different now slightly. Less defended, more simply curious. "You brought me the book," he said. "Yes." "You didn't say anything about it." "No." "Why not?" Vivian thought about this. "Because it wasn't about me," she said. "It was about the book. And I thought you'd know what it meant without me explaining." Mason considered this for a long time, long enough that the train reached their stop and they were standing on the platform and climbing the stairs into the cold December air before he spoke again. He was walking between them on the sidewalk, hands in his coat pockets, and he said, without any preamble, "I liked the museum." "So did I," Vivian said. A pause. "You can come next month," Mason said, "if you want." Nathan looked straight ahead at the cold, bright street and felt the world rearrange itself around that sentence. 6 words from a 6-year-old, delivered without ceremony, carrying the full weight of everything they'd cost. Vivian said, "I'd like that." "We always get hot chocolate from the cart outside," Mason said. "My dad gets 2, but I think you should get 1 too." "That sounds right," she said. Mason nodded once, the conclusive nod of someone who has reached a verdict, and kept walking. Nathan reached over and found Vivian's hand in the cold. She took it without looking at him. He could feel from the way she held it that she was feeling something she was not going to put into words right now, and he was grateful for that, because he wasn't sure he could put it into words either. That evening, after Mason was asleep, Nathan sat at the kitchen table with his phone and looked at the message from Lucas, the formal confirmation that the Morrison Group situation was resolved, that the Pacific Northwest acquisition had proceeded as intended, that the board had issued a statement that contained. For the first time, Nathan R. Caldwell's name in the body of a press release. He put the phone down. He looked at the corner of the wall where Mason's handprints were, green and orange and blue, the exact size of 4-year-old palms, pressed into the paint on a Wednesday afternoon when it was raining outside and they'd had nowhere to be and all the time in the world. He thought about Rebecca and the bronze sculpture and the weight of things that had to actually stand up. He thought about the anglerfish and the real light and the difference between the kind that traps and the kind that finds. He thought about Vivian, sitting across from a board that was not designed for her, not flinching, letting the silence do work. Walking into a museum in jeans with no performance and no plan, and standing beside a 6-year-old who was testing her, and reading the panel about bioluminescence, and waiting. He thought about Mason on the platform, in the cold, delivering his verdict in 6 words that had taken 12 months to earn. "You can come next month, if you want." This was what it looked like when a child decided to trust. Not a dramatic declaration, not a tearful surrender. 6 words on a sidewalk in December, offered quietly, to someone who had earned them by being exactly herself and waiting for exactly as long as it took. Nathan's phone buzzed again. A text from Vivian, 3 words. "He's something extraordinary." He typed back, "He gets it from his mother." A pause. Then, "He gets some of it from you." He sat with that for a while. Then he typed, "Thank you. For not pushing. For waiting. For reading the panel." Her response came after a moment. "Thank you for letting me earn it. Both of you." He set the phone down and looked at the handprints on the wall. Rebecca would have liked her. He had said that at the gallery, and he had meant it then, and he meant it now, more fully. Not because Vivian was like Rebecca. She wasn't. They were different people, shaped by different fires, but because Rebecca had had no patience for people who pretended to be less than they were. And Vivian Cole, CEO of Meridian Capital, who walked into a mid-century diner by accident one October morning and defended a stranger carrying plates, had never once pretended to be anything other than exactly what she was. Just Vivian, a woman in good shoes moving through morning carrying more than most people could see. The apartment was quiet. Mason's door was closed. The basil on the windowsill needed water. Nathan Caldwell, 34 years old, widower, billionaire, waiter, father of one extraordinary 6-year-old boy who had just, in 6 words on a cold December sidewalk, changed the shape of the world, sat at his kitchen table in the still apartment and felt, for the first time in 2 years and 3 months, that the weight he was carrying was not a burden. It was ballast. The kind that keeps a boat steady in the deep water. The kind that lets you go out further than you thought you could. The kind that if you're patient enough and honest enough and willing to wait for the light that finds instead of traps, brings you home.